Logan Reed rubbed his eyes and checked the clock on the ambulance dashboard. 4:42 a.m. Almost time to go home. After 15 grueling hours on shift, he could practically feel the phantom weight of his bed calling to him. One more call, maybe two, and he'd be done. Then the radio crackled to life. Unit 5, respond to a male, approximately 78 years old. Unresponsive, not breathing. CPR not in progress. Logan sat up straighter. No CPR? That was bad. His partner, Mason, groaned. You gotta be kidding me. Last call of the night, and it's a full code? Logan didn't answer, didn't need to. He just flicked on the sirens and hit the gas. Because whether it was his last call or not, someone needed help, and he was going to answer. The house sat at the end of a dark, quiet cul-de-sac, porch lights flickering against the early morning mist. As soon as Logan and Mason stepped out of the rig, they heard it, sobbing, gut-wrenching, chest-heaving sobs. The front door was already wide open, and standing in the doorway was a woman, mid-40s, disheveled, eyes red-rimmed and swollen. She looked at them like they were angels, or executioners. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's just sleeping, right?" Logan had heard those words before, and they were never true. They rushed inside. The air smelled of stale coffee, old books, and something heavier, something wrong. Logan's stomach clenched. He already knew. He stepped into the living room, and there, in a recliner, was the patient. An elderly man, gray hair combed neatly to the side, hands resting gently in his lap, eyes closed as if he had simply drifted off. Except he wasn't breathing. His skin was pale and waxy, lips tinged with a deep blue hue, fingers slightly curled in the unmistakable stillness of death. Logan touched the man's wrist, cold, stiff. Too long gone? Mason met his eyes. No pulse, no hope. They were too late. But before Logan could say a word, a child bolted into the room. "Grandpa?" The little boy couldn't have been older than 6 or 7. Pajamas wrinkled, socks mismatched, blonde hair sticking up in uneven tufts. His voice was too hopeful, too innocent for the moment. "Grandpa, you have to wake up now. Mommy's crying." Logan's chest tightened. This was the part of the job he hated most. The part where he wasn't just a paramedic, but a witness to a family's worst day. The boy ran up to the recliner, tugging at his grandfather's limp hand. His tiny fingers curled around the cold skin, trying to shake life back into it. Logan instinctively stepped forward, but before he could say anything, the boy's mother appeared behind him, her voice trembling. "Baby, come here." The little boy turned, confused. "He won't wake up. Why won't he wake up?" His mother's face crumbled, and she dropped to her knees, pulling him into a crushing hug. Logan forced himself to keep moving, to do what he was trained for. He pulled out his stethoscope, pressing it against the man's chest. Nothing. Checked his pupils, fixed and dilated. Ran a quick cardiac monitor strip, flatline, no electrical activity. It was over. It had been over for hours. Mason quietly stepped beside him. "We have to call it." Logan exhaled. He hated this part. He turned to the mother, whose eyes were glued to him, silently begging for something, anything other than what he was about to say. But there was no way to soften the truth. "I'm sorry," Logan said, voice steady but low. "He's gone." The mother let out a choked breath, like she had been holding it the whole time. Then she crumbled. Her body shook with sobs so violent she could barely keep her balance. Her son held on to her, still too young to understand what was happening. Logan forced himself to stay professional, even as the boy's small voice broke through the crying. "But he's right there!" The little boy's voice cut through the air like a blade. "But he's right there!" His mother sobbed into his hair, her body trembling. She couldn't answer him. So, now it was on Logan. The worst part of the job wasn't the blood. It wasn't the wrecks, the overdoses, or the horror of trying to keep a body from breaking completely apart. It was this. The moments when death wasn't violent, but still felt just as cruel. Logan crouched down, keeping his voice as soft as he could. "Hey, buddy," he said gently. "I know it looks like Grandpa is just sleeping, but sometimes when people get really, really sick, they don't wake up." The boy frowned, his little hands balling into tiny fists. "But he was okay yesterday." Mason turned away, rubbing a hand over his face. Logan felt his throat tighten, but he kept his face calm, steady. Because this boy was too young to see the truth for what it was. That sometimes people left without warning. That sometimes one moment they were here and the next they were gone. That sometimes death didn't care if you still had things left to say. But how do you tell that to a kid? So he just said, "I'm sorry, bud." And the boy's tiny face crumpled. And that was it. That was the moment everything broke. The house became a storm of grief. The boy sobbed, clutching his mother's shirt, as if holding on to her would bring his grandfather back. The mother was still on the floor, barely able to breathe through the gasps of her crying. An older woman, maybe an aunt, maybe a neighbor, had come in at some point, trying to console her, but it was useless. Logan stood there, the outsider in their grief, the one who had walked in and shattered every last ounce of hope. And that was the job. It took another 30 minutes before the police and coroner arrived, before Logan could start writing his report. "Natural causes?" the officer muttered, shaking his head. "Died in his sleep, most likely. Hell of a way to go." Maybe, but it didn't feel peaceful. Not with the mother still crying in the other room. Not with the boy's words still ringing in Logan's head. "But he's right there!" Logan climbed into the ambulance and shut the door. Mason sat in the driver's seat, silent. For a long moment, they didn't say a word. Then Mason sighed, shaking his head. "Jesus?" Logan said nothing. Just looked down at his hands. They weren't shaking. They never shook anymore. But something inside him was. The radio crackled, dispatch calling out another unit for another emergency. The night wasn't over. Not for them, but for Logan. That call would stay with him long after the shift ended. Because some nights, the dead don't just leave. Sometimes they stay with you.